Holy shit, that guy got destroyed. There's no question about it. You got his ass, wholly and soundly. Now 2 guys in dress blues are gonna have to go to his wife's house with a folded flag, and that's your fault. You did this. You bested your opponent. You're the one who won the day. And surely it was impressive. In fact, it might have been so impressive that we might have to, do something about it. You might even know what I'm referring to, and yeah, it's not nice. It's even rude to do it. But we're the winner. It's our right to do it, because after a kill like that, you've just got to taunt.
Conga, you fools!
That's right, our subject this time around is taunts. And even though I'm not much of a braggart, taunts are one of my favorite parts of games. I love them almost as much as I love the 14 years of peace my small Romanian kingdom gets after we rise up and kill the recurring vampire, Duke Groja von Boslav, at least until he returns to his unnatural hellish life. Taunts are a kind of a universal language, right? They're a bonding agent for all of the different branches and fragments that a game's community can have, a salve for division. Because regardless of who you are or why you taunt, and there are a lot of reasons, we all like doing it. You can taunt because you just killed an enraged scrub who's very quick to blame his own team and drag down the vibes of the lobby. Or because you just destroyed a fellow tryhard in an even 1v1 duel. Or because you just completely fumbled a kill and now you want to rub your opponent's face in it in a facetious, joking manner. It's a part of the game that anybody, and I truly mean anybody, can enjoy, and they quite often do. In fact, taunts are so well indulged that they've become a massive thrusting force for the industry. Games are now selling millions upon millions of golden drachmas worth of animations for you to use after you kill somebody. They've become a very important cornerstone to the culture of competitive games. There's sort of a life imitates art, chicken and the egg kind of cycle going on. A dance or a gesture or a thing will happen in real life and subsequently inspire a taunt. Or sometimes the reverse happens, where an animation from a beloved game inspires a real-life equivalence. But this begs a question. Why does my Pepsi can taste like it's full of pig's blood and mercury? And more importantly, why do some gestures touch the hearts of their communities while others make little to no impact? Now, as a YouTuber, it is well known that I am a boundless oracle of knowledge unburdened by ego, but this isn't really a question that I can answer. You can come up with some quantifications as to why taunts end up being more popular than others. For example, an emote that is free, or an emote in a game that is free, is going to be exposed and used by more players, meaning that more people are probably going to form an attachment to that gesture, and it's also going to become a part of the language of the player base. Some taunts also get a lot of love because of the context in which they're used. For example, this pose that Akuma does from Street Fighter is probably one of the most well-known things in the entire franchise. It's not technically like a taunt, you can't just do it whenever you want, but Akuma only ever does it after hitting his Raging Demon Super, which is one of the most powerful and flashy supers the series has ever produced. As such, it's always a landmark moment of every match in which it's featured, whether it hits or doesn't. And when someone is able to hit this under the stress of a high-tier competition, you can bet people go nuts. But outside of that, it would probably take me dozens of hours of theorizing about the different reasons that somebody might like a specific emote, and even then, I will inevitably not be able to cover all of them. A taunt's validity is going to largely depend on subjective factors. Which ones ending up meaning something to you will be a result of what games you like, and what kinds of animations you like, and where and how you use them, and on whom and with whom. In fact, to showcase this, let's do a little bit of an experiment. I bet you and I don't have the same favorite taunt. Here's how we're gonna do it. You go into the comments and you type out your favorite taunt from whatever game. No editing your comment, because if you do, you're disqualified, and I'll be forced to activate my cobalt-spiced nuclear bomb, which, when detonated, will result in a radioactive cloud that sweeps the Earth's surface and ends human life as we know it. And then at the end of the video, I'll tell you my favorite taunt, and no, it's not the one on screen. And if you and I have the same favorite taunt, I will give you 5 kalukagames, which are redeemable at any one of my 296 bed and breakfast locations. Go ahead and make your choice now. Alright, now put that in your pocket and don't bring it out until the end of the video. Now, while we can't realistically determine what are the absolute best taunts for every person across all games, what we can do is go over what I think are the grand slam examples in the world of bragging, and explore why I think these ones are on the top. So let's all sit back, relax, and enjoy talking about the wonderful world of dancing around to make children feel awful for being bad at a video game that we've all been playing longer than they've been alive. The origin of taunts is almost a joke of a question. As long as humans have been competing over something, which we've been doing since the bloodthirsty Dutch invented war in 942 AD, there's been gloating and incitement about victory. And as a competitive medium, the same is true for video games. One of the most elegant taunts that we've ever seen comes from this lost, bygone era, the humble teabag. Compared to what we have now, teabagging is a little bit quaint. Today we have taunts that are almost hilariously elaborate, like you'll begin to dance and then once you start dancing, music will start playing and there'll be particle effects that spew everywhere, and by comparison, crouching up and down just isn't as exciting. As such, I don't think it's really a surprise that teabagging has been largely supplanted by dedicated animations. Now, if you're some kind of disgusting flea-ridden Philistine and you don't know what teabagging is, it's really simple. It's just crouching over and over on somebody's body. This is supposed to simulate pressing your genitalia into their mouth, but I don't think that many people really imply that when they teabag these days. I think just the act of doing it has kind of taken on its own identity, divorced from its original meaning. Much like how my new neighbor Sheila has her own apartment because she got divorced from her original husband. Now, that all being said, I do still think that teabags have some positive traits. For one thing, teabagging is really easy to do and to make. If you have crouching in your game, then you already have your first taunt. And in that same vein, this is also what helps teabagging tie together a lot of different games and a lot of different players in a sort of weird but unique way. This ubiquity extends past just the players and also to the games that can possibly host it. A lot of games, whether it's for monetary or thematic concerns, can't really allow for the player to go around singing pop songs or driving little cartoon vehicles, but they can just as easily as any other game allow you to teabag. This allows teabagging as a taunt to exist in basically any environment it wants to. It's like the cockroaches of goating. Funnily enough, teabagging also has some very niche functional advantages too. Teabagging doesn't make you inactionable like a long-winded animation might, so it's actually quite a bit safer. Whether this is a shrewd element of strategy or cowardice is up to you. I would make your decision quick though, because the gas is starting to fill the room. The best games for teabagging, and I think this is bar none, had to be the Halo franchise. Halo, which should be renamed to Hollow because it's an empty shell of the series that it once was, used to be synonymous with teabagging. This is largely and either immaturishly or endearingly because Halo allowed for ragdolls to persist in the world for a very long time, but more importantly, you could move them, so teabagging somebody's corpse caused them to do this funky spasm, and that's all it took to cement it into Halo culture. Of course, Halo was not the first or the last place for teabagging to happen, but I don't think any other series then or now has the same association with the action that Halo did. Even now, you can see like echoes and fragments of this. If you go on Discord and you search up an animated image, at least what I get as the first result is Halo 3. If you search up just straight up teabagging on YouTube and you filter out the 800 YouTube shorts they want to show you, the third result is a Halo 3 video from 16 years ago. Now, of course, your mileage may vary. Everybody's algorithm is tuned to their specific desires and, more importantly, their purchasing preferences. Mine has no doubt been mutated by my recent binge watching of every video I can find about the 29 pizza delivery delivery drivers that went missing after doing their job at Cincinnati Councilman Mark Jeffries' estate, but even so, you should get somewhat similar results. I don't really see teabagging anymore. Again, it has basically just been replaced by animations that you can buy for money. I can't scientifically prove that it happens less, this is just anecdotal, but again, I do think it's perfectly understandable. These emotes have gotten insane, and they are very tantalizing and exciting to look at. This isn't to mention, of course, that teabagging can only really communicate so many different ideas, whereas animations can do literally whatever you want. Some games also just don't really fare well with teabagging. A lot of Battle Royale games these days don't even spawn a ragdoll for you to teabag, which was half of the fun. Not to mention, some games also have a limit on repeated crouching like CSGO for balance reasons. Ragdolls also don't typically sync over the network because that would be stupid, and it's much more efficient for each client to handle their simulation independently. This sometimes causes desyncs as to where a body actually is. If you've ever seen somebody teabag the dirt next to you instead of your body after killing you, this is why. This is of course unlike an animation state that has to be broadcast to all of the other players so that they know what that person is doing. One of the last safe harbors teabagging has, at least again anecdotally, is fighting games. Especially fighting games that have some kind of a stun mechanic, which gives you an opportunity to get 4 or 5 teabags in, as opposed to doing a long animation that might make you drop your stun opportunity. And that's not to forget the ever-present relevance of taunt to get bodied compilations. The last, I guess, advantage that I think teabagging has over emotes is that it's kind of inherently less evil. Now, we're not going to get super far into this topic because this is a den of vipers, but teabagging is very innocent. It was formed organically from the pieces that players had at their disposal to express something that the community wanted to say. It wasn't there to make money or to capitalize on like a popular trend or to promote an IP or something. It's just teabagging for the sake of it. For lack of a better term, teabagging is just sort of pure. Maybe not quite as pure as the mithril swords and bullets that my friend Baxter was caught trying to smuggle into the Islamic Nolish Republic, but still pretty pure. Just because it has no ulterior motives, it's just here to be what it is. And you know, that fills me with good vibes, and I hope that these good vibes keep going and that this video isn't ruined by Team Fortress 2. Oh no. Jokes aside, Team Fortress 2 is spectacular. This is a game with a fantastic fundamental base, really good character designs, really good weapon designs, and really good yaoi ships. But it's also one that I think, for the most part, is going to be remembered for what I believe to be the wrong things. Now, of course, nobody is inherently wrong for caring more about one part of this game than another, unless the part you like is one that I don't, in which case you are factually wrong and morally evil. But to me, the important part of Team Fortress 2 is how well it established a deep, skillful, and competitive fundamental base, and how willing the devs were to experiment and bend the rules of that base. It's a game just chock full of radical and fun designs. It allows for people to be the most brutal, devastating pub stomper scout, and also Pyro Shark. TF2 is also arguably the last of its kind. Arena shooters and even most of the games inspired by arena shooters are functionally extinct, but even just games in the match play format that don't have you either aiming down sights or waiting for a cooldown to expire for 50% of the gameplay are just not really that popular anymore. And Team Fortress 2 proves, even though it is an exceptional case, that this kind of game still has an audience, and that you can make a game that appeals both to incredibly skilled tryhards and everybody else. And while I'm sure a lot of people agree with me, I mean, my channel wouldn't exist if people didn't, I also think that there are going to be a lot of other things that stain Team Fortress 2's legacy. Team Fortress 2's identity, especially for people on the outside looking in, is marred by how delusional and annoying its fan base can be at times, the neglect that the game suffers from at the hands of Valve, at least that the community perceives, and almost assuredly the fact that Team Fortress 2, for both better and worse, might I include, is the grandfather of the games as a service business model. And one subsector of that business model that I hope people pay attention to is TF2's taunts, which, unlike being exiled to the Mirror Realm, are really great, a lot of fun, and something that Team Fortress 2 fosters much better than I think any other game I've seen. Funnily enough though, I don't think the artistry is what I like the most about the taunts in this game. Mind you, I'm not saying the TF2 taunts are like badly made or anything, actually quite the opposite. I think they're all quite good, and certainly better than anything I can make. In fact, there's a couple of standout examples I just want to highlight real quick. There's some obvious ones, like Heavy's finger guns, that one's legendary. I've always thought Engineer's pistol taunt and Soldier's loser finger salute were really great, and for the latter, very fitting to the character. And then of course you have stuff like Schadenfreude, which is just like the best. But what is appealing to me about Team Fortress 2 taunts is not, again, necessarily how good they are, but how well fostered they are. Valve must have some kind of an airtight patent related to this, because I don't know how else it could be that every shooter, or at least most shooters, have some kind of post-kill spectating, but none of them hold a candle to or just stole the method from Team Fortress 2. And this is coming from somebody who doesn't even like to give Team Fortress 2 credit like that. In fact, I hate this game so much I took 500 copies of the original Orange Box release and threw it into the vortex that's underneath of Fairfax, Virginia. It is possible this is the dorkiest sentence ever uttered, but if I had to make like a tier list of post-death shooter spectator modes, at the very bottom would be exactly just that, just straight up spectating. This is the path I think most games take, is just allowing you to either see what your opponent is seeing or see what your teammates are seeing because they don't want to show you what your opponent can see and give you that information. This is popular with games like tactical shooters or extraction shooters, games that don't want to betray the opponent's position just because you got killed. After that would be like a static third-person camera like in Halo. This is perfectly serviceable, though I do think it still misses out on showing you some of what your enemy is doing. Namely, anybody who kills you from really far away, which happens a lot in Halo, doesn't get an opportunity to show off. A replay kill cam I would place even above this, though for the purposes of taunting, they're actually pretty bad because they show the past and not the present. And then finally, we have the Mac Daddy of them all, the Team Fortress 2 zoom in freeze frame kill cam. This method is unmatched because it guarantees you an audience to insult. So you can taunt with absolute confidence that at least one other person on the enemy team, in fact the most important person, the one you just killed, has to see it. In fact, Team Fortress 2 is really weirdly good at trying to instigate inter-server rivalries. Dominations and revenge, which are server-wide messages that reward you for, respectively, killing somebody 4 times and then killing them after they killed you 4 times, are again things that are unfortunately unique to Team Fortress 2. It's a relic from a game that expected players to be able to own their own servers and form their own communities, but I don't see why it couldn't work in more games today. This makes TF2 taunts, at least some of the time, sting just a little bit harder than they could in other games. And TF2 has no shortage of, in my opinion, largely quite well-made taunts to bust out with. What is rather interesting though is not when people use taunts to taunt somebody, but more so all of the other things that TF2 players use taunts to communicate. The community has its own secret language that is expressed entirely through gestures, much like the Order of the Sewn Mouth but without all the sacrifices. This is why I personally like taunts that can be used for multiple different types of things, like Schadenfreude. You can use it to genuinely laugh at something you think is funny, or you can use it to make fun of somebody who tried to kill you and failed. They have much more versatility, but some emotes in TF2 go beyond just being used for communication. Some of them have functional applications, and some of them are even so powerful that they're banned at the highest level of competition. Every taunt in the game places your camera into third person. Now, in many cases, this is completely fine, and it doesn't really harm the game in any way because, again, a taunt is a very vulnerable, uncancelable state. But not all of them are. Some taunts allow you to cancel the animation at your leisure, which, combined with the change in camera, allows you to see around corners without exposing yourself. Obviously, that's not how the game should be played, and this provides a significant advantage to anybody who's forked over the cash to get a taunt like this. But even if money weren't a factor, you shouldn't be allowed to corner peek with no downside. This is why these taunts are considered to be ban-worthy, and I think that's pretty understandable. I think it's also pretty understandable that this could even happen. It's almost impossible to add something to a game, especially a thing that works differently than the other stuff you already have in a game that's already done, without having some kind of unforeseen consequences or functionality. But what about taunts that have entirely intentional functionality? Oh yeah, finally we're getting into the tasty shit. Team Fortress 2 is once again, sadly, the unique home to a very different type of taunt, the taunt kill.
Taunt kills exist for effectively no reason. There is almost never a time where going for a taunt kill is the right thing to do, because again, you're locked in the animation, they're very slow, you can't aim or move to defend yourself or anything, so the only time you're gonna hit somebody is if they're standing still, or if they run into it at the last second. But also, nobody is using a taunt kill because it's effective. We use them because they're difficult, they're awesome, and they're funny. They need no further justification for their existence. Though I think that for the purposes of our topic today, this is actually a bad thing. Taunt kills are so admirable that it's really hard to get frustrated with them, and as such, they're not very good taunts. You would seriously have to be the most miserable, cockeyed, toe-sucking, silver-tongued, whorish, award-winning, pickled, bar-certified, rum-running jerk to have a problem with them, which is what makes them so bad at pissing people off. Although, earlier I did say they were only mostly useless, because there is one situation, and it's honestly not even that uncommon of a situation, and it's also a very important situation, where taunt kills have a unique strength, at least some of them, because certain taunt kills, like for the Huntsman, have a stun as a part of their attack. And this is, on paper at least, incredibly effective against Ubercharge. Now, if you're not a TF2 fan, and somehow you still found your way onto this channel, maybe because you're an FBI agent that was tasked with surveilling me after those things I said about Cincinnati Councilman Mark Jeffries, if by some miraculous providence you don't know what Ubercharge is, it's the medic hero's ultimate ability. He can activate it after spending enough time healing his idiotic teammates who keep pencil jumping into sentry guns, or alternatively by sitting in the back long enough with his boyfriend, the Demo Man, before they both decide to go and ruin the game for the other team of hapless casuals. And the Ubercharge makes the two of them invincible, so that presents a pretty tough problem for the enemy team because you can't kill them. Normally, the only things you can do, and you should still be doing this anyway, against an Ubercharge are either to run away or hide from it, to sacrifice yourself either distracting it or keeping it away from your team like with Air Blast, pushing one of the two combo members off of a cliff, or, and this is about the worst thing you could do that still works, you could try to stun them. While Ubercharge makes you invincible to damage, for some reason it doesn't make you invincible to stuns. This is only a hypothesis, but I believe this is a holdover from when the Sandman used to be allowed to stun Ubered players. After being heavily influenced by Satan, Valve added the Sandman and alongside it the stun mechanic in 2009 during the Scout update. Valve would then spend the rest of the Sandman's life attempting to wrangle it into something fun until they just got rid of it basically, and one of the nerfs they inflicted upon it was that it could no longer stun Ubered targets. However, Valve did this by adding a conditional within the Bat class, not to the stun condition itself. So other sources of stuns could still affect Ubers, even today with things like the Holiday Punch. This is probably even more unlikely to happen than a regular taunt kill because it requires specific taunts to be used, and people who are being Ubered are usually being very proactive and killing you. But it does happen, and I think it's kind of funny that something that is otherwise so inconsequential to the gameplay of TF2 can also hypothetically beat the most powerful mechanic. However unlikely that it might be that it happens. Another thing that I think Team Fortress 2 does well in this case is using taunts for gameplay where they're applicable. Valve are somewhat notorious misers when it comes to their assets. They reuse everything they can.
Arrow fodder.
The legend has it that in 2015, a newly hired sound engineer suggested to Gabe Newell that they make a new game that doesn't feature 19 Half-Life 2 sound effects from 2003, and on the spot Gabe ate him. And everywhere in Team Fortress 2 that Valve needed to, or just kind of wanted to, they reused taunts for designs where taunts fit really well. Sometimes even coming up with, again, really experimental, goofy weapons that are built entirely around taunts. The king of this has to be the Holiday Punch, an extremely weird weapon design that very well exemplifies what I'm talking about. It's a melee weapon for heavy, the slowest character in the game, a weapon with no range, where if you get a crit, you force the enemy into the Schadenfreude taunt. Now, in regular servers this can happen randomly, but for servers with random crits turned off, you can also get them by hitting basically a backstab. And you happen to have just enough time to get out your own taunt kill against that person. It's such a weird idea, and I don't know why they added it to the game, but I'm really glad they did, because it is completely unproblematic. It's so weak that this weapon could never become an issue. But again, it's just so unique, and frankly so fun because of the challenge of doing it. One of the things that I like about Team Fortress 2 from like a game design perspective is stuff like this. This is the kind of weapon design we will never see in another video game until TF2 fans make one. The other two Knights of the Realm are the Phlogistinator and the Amputator. Now, between these two weapons, I think the Amputator is the better designed weapon because it's just not problematic, and I think the Phlogistinator is very mildly problematic and casual. But as for who uses their taunt better, I think that actually does go to the Flog. The taunt that the Flog forces you to do to get your crits is not only a good point of game design because it means that if you use it wrong, you can just get blown up, but also I think it's probably the most elegant reuse of an asset between the two. The Flog had a job it needed done, and the Pyro default taunt does the job perfectly. Not to mention, there's also some cool stuff you can do with canceling the Flog taunt. The Amputator's healing taunt, on the other hand, is just kind of a thing it is capable of doing. I know there's a community of people who really like the Amputator, but I don't think it's as good as a lot of people make it out to be. I think it's the kind of weapon that people really want to be good, so they use it more often and swear by it more than they should. The Amputator, or at least the taunt part of the Amputator, requires you to have like a good chunk of your team all in one spot, which inherently means that this is situational, because you're not capable of forcing your team to be where you need them to be, and if you have anything less than like 4 or so allies nearby, it's just not really that effective, especially not in comparison to just using the medigun, and that's doubly so when you pit it against the medigun as supplemented by the crossbow. And obviously when you're doing that, you're not stuck in an animation that leaves you defenseless. You can shoot or surf or run away or whatever you need to do if you get attacked. I still think it's really cool, by the way. I just wish it was more effective. Now, this isn't a particularly important point in TF2's favor. After all, it doesn't really matter if your game uses taunts well. This is an incredibly narrow and arbitrary quantification we've made here. But I do think it showcases the team's resourcefulness and their willingness to do cool stuff for the sake of it being fun. I know there's a healthy amount of people who don't like it when I talk about fighting games, but tough shit. Because one of the things that I like about fighting games and about Team Fortress 2 in a sort of very base level way is that they embody this idea. A fighting game ultimately, from like a design perspective, is nothing but giving a player a cohesive and powerfully designed character, one that can do all kinds of evil nonsense to their opponent, using a lot of powerful abilities and so forth, and then giving the other person another character designed in the same way, and just kind of smashing the two together. Because the objective is to make a character that is powerful, you can allow the player to do some fucked up but really cool stuff. The basic idea is that as long as it's fun for a player to do their character's powerful stuff, and it's interesting and challenging and equally fun to stop your opponent from doing their cool stuff, then everything is cool and everyone is having fun. And I think that Team Fortress 2 is largely the same. It's willing to bend the rules to make powerful and, if not, then at least enjoyable weapons with odd functions, all anchored through that same formula. It seems simple when you look back at it, but the game enforcing that every weapon can have a powerful, interesting upside, which is counterbalanced by some kind of exploitable weakness, is what makes this game fun. Because taking advantage of your strengths and your opponent's weaknesses, while not equally so, are both fun. At least when Valve isn't adding weapons like the Homewrecker to just completely ruin this entire fucking thing. Taunts are, again, a small and largely optional fragment of this ideology, but I think they're a good showcase of it. If you're willing to break down the barriers of your gameplay to the point where you come up with something as out of the box as your laughing cosmetic taunt being a major gameplay mechanic for a weapon, you're probably capable of trying out some less extreme but equally fun and indulgent designs. Sometimes TF2 did escape the orbit of its core gameplay a bit too much or too recklessly for my taste. For example, I will never lie to my audience and say that the Sandman was fun. Good riddance. But I think more times than not, the team made weapons that improved the game. And I'm glad that, generally at least, the weapons that did this were more like the Holiday Punch and not so often like meek remixes of existing weapons like the Family Business. Like, if you look at the actual design of the Family Business, it's basically just, this is a shotgun, because these two stats are more or less a wash.
that has 2 more shells. If this were on any other character, people wouldn't like it. It would replace the shotgun like it does for shotgun heavy, but because it's the heavy running around with a shotgun, it's fine. It's like a brick, you know? It's not flashy, it's not exciting, it's not fantastical, it just has a function, and it does that function very well. You can't really do anything, like, super fun with it, unless, well, wait a minute. I could take the brick, and I could throw it at the motorcade belonging to Cincinnati Councilman Mark Jeffries. I wasn't entirely sure where to put this next part, so we're just doing it now because it's my video and anybody who has a problem with it will get pressed into the Kalukagami Navy. But while it is really uncommon for a game to have a taunt that kills people, it's not that uncommon for a game to have a kill that taunts people. These kinds of taunts are known as executions or assassinations. They usually come in 2 basic forms, either as a reward for getting a very unlikely or difficult kill. For example, if you sneak up behind somebody and you melee them in Halo Reach, you get a cool animation where your Spartan beats the shit out of them. Or there are games like Apex Legends, where after enemies lose all of their health, they're not killed, they are instead downed, and you have to go through the process of killing them again in a more defenseless state. And one way to ensure that they die is to execute them. The best game, at least out of the ones that I've ever played, to do executions probably was Apex Legends. After you get downed in that game, you are almost assuredly dead, but only almost. It was entirely within the realm of possibility, especially if you got killed at a long range, to evade your attackers and get back to safety. And because you're downed with a shield that can block bullets, it's also not particularly hard to stall your own death and act as a distraction, which can put the enemy team into a bad position. However, they can guarantee an inescapable kill by doing an execution animation on you, and by doing so, they refill their health and shields. But to do so, they have to lock themselves behind an animation, meaning that they are much easier to ambush. And then it's up to the attacker to decide if it's worth putting themselves at risk to get the free health. They have to measure whether or not they can just kill you with guns quickly after they've downed you, and even after they do so, they have to actually go and do it, and they have to make decisions about whether or not it's even safe enough at the moment to go for a kill on a downed player. There's a lot of strategy going on for both sides. Artistically speaking though, Apex finishers are really hit or miss. Some of them are fantastic. For example, I think this Loba finisher is great. It has really great motion, it has really good key poses, it does really cool stuff with the camera to make things feel more impactful and dynamic, and then on the other hand you have Ballistic lightly shaking somebody. Now, as far as assassinations go, there's 2 games that I think easily take the crown. Nudity Sex Porn Versus and the Torturing Joseph Goebbels Obby, but I can't really show you either of those on a video, so we're gonna have to settle for second place, which is Halo Reach and Titanfall 2. Each of these games features assassinations in effectively the exact same way. If you get up behind somebody and you melee them, you get a cool animation. There is no functional advantage to doing so, it's just for aura farming. And if I had to choose between the 2, even though I really love Titanfall 2, and I really love its executions, I think I would have to give it to Halo Reach. Though frankly, these 2 are so close that if anybody told me one over the other was their preference, I could completely understand. I would even go as far as to say that Titanfall 2 has by far the more creative set. A lot of the finishers in Halo Reach are a guy getting stabbed, whereas Titanfall 2 does a lot of cool stuff associated with the different pilot abilities you can take. That being said, while Halo Reach's roster is like 30 different animations of people getting stabbed or hit in the head, they're really good animations of people getting stabbed or hit in the head. They have fantastic key poses and really great timing that allows those key poses to sear themselves into your brain. The motion is also very impactful. Not to mention there are different assassinations, not just between Spartans, but also for all of the different Covenant races, which are applicable both in single player and in multiplayer since you can play as an elite. And seeing a smaller attacker wrestle and cream on a larger victim is really cool. And I also want to highlight how these assassinations were implemented. For some reason, there are a great deal of conditions that can be considered when the game chooses a taunt, like if both players are in the air,
Revenge.
or if one person is above another.
or what weapon you have, or even where you're aiming when you initiate the assassination. I really don't think anybody would have noticed if you had anything other than an air-to-air or a ground-to-ground taunt, but the game considers a great number of different relationships between the attacker and the victim when it selects an animation. Assassinations have continued to feature in a lot of different games. For some reason, Call of Duty has become an incredible hub of these. And I'll admit, there's probably a lot of examples that I just don't know about, so if you know about a game that has really great assassinations, why don't you tell me about it in the comments? And now we wait. Now, those of you who have actually played Titanfall 2 might be saying, hey pal, what about Titan terminations? Surely that's gotta move the needle in Titanfall's favor, and they are really cool. But I think that Titan terminations don't really have as much of an effect on the gameplay as I would have liked. And also, and this isn't really their fault, but more so just kind of a circumstance of how big Titans are, sometimes they don't really look that good. It's impressive that they look as good as they do, but if you do a termination in an enclosed space, the camera really doesn't have a good way to look at everything. It collides with the geometry. And also, there's only 7 Titans, and TAUNTS terminations just don't look good. I'm not sure what's wrong with them. He just kind of translates between poses. I'm not sure if this is like a bug that has been there for 10 years or what, but let's not be so negative, because even though there's one Titan who does terminations about as poorly as he could, there's one other Titan who does them very well. Monarch is the game's long game Titan. It can level up throughout the match, so you're incentivized to keep it alive as long as you can so that you can get to your different stages. And Monarch uniquely can steal batteries with a specific loadout. Batteries are basically like a Titan health kit from other Titans upon termination, which is really cool. Personally, I kind of wish this was more of a universal thing, but at the very least, it being a unique function of the Monarch is about the best place that it could be. Now, while all of this is really cool, what if there was a game that had taunts that were even more deeply tied to the gameplay? One that was somehow even older than TF2? Street Fighter 3 Third Strike is the best game in the Street Fighter 3 franchise. And that sentence sounds really stupid, but it's true. From a gameplay standpoint, Third Strike has to be the game with the best taunts, bar none. Taunts in Third Strike are not just taunts, they are instead referred to as personal actions, and are basically just little moves that provide some kind of a benefit to the character that does them. The taunts in Third Strike are really weird for this because they're all completely unique, but the boons that they give their character usually fall into one of a few categories, but then there's also some taunts that give you like one each from 2 separate categories, or one category at first and then another later or randomly, but also some of them don't do that and have no equivalence. It's really elaborate and there's no way to get through it without just unpacking the entire thing. Now, the general idea of why these exist is very simple and, in my opinion, very ingenious. In Japanese, there's a concept known as okizeme, which means, loosely, to buy a speedboat and a Draco and to shoot at fishermen until the Coast Guard get involved. But in the context of fighting games, it means the wake-up game. This translation is very literal for a good reason. In a fighting game, players can knock each other onto the ground. When this happens, the player that is left standing is at an advantage because they're still able to act, while the player who got sent to the floor has to get back up. Because of this, the active player, or the attacker, can set up a well-timed attack that hits the very moment the defender gets back on their feet. This means that the defender can't challenge them, at least in most situations, because the very frame that they're actionable again, they get hit. This forces the defender to, defend. But in a fighting game, your defensive options are usually mutually exclusive. There are some shenanigans you can do to defend against multiple things either at once or in sequence, but generally speaking, you can block a strike attack, but you can't block a throw. You can tech the throw attempt by throwing at the same time, but if you do so, you get hit by that frame 1 attack. You can't have both. This situation is highly advantageous for the attacker. If the attacker guesses wrong, the worst that happens is that they get their attack blocked or their throw is countered, and then each player is left at almost equal footing. Sometimes the standing player is even still at an advantage after they get blocked. But if the defender guesses wrong, they get banished to the realm of suffering, where the cruel angels sing nothing but 2020's pop country all day. But also they get hit, which is way worse and can lead to looping Oki situations where you're forced to defend yourself until you get it right at the cost of your health for each attempt. The idea behind a taunt in Third Strike is that because it takes a lot of time and leaves you with your shields down, you want to do it at times where your opponent can't stop you, either at, say, a long distance outside of the range of their attacks, or when you get a knockdown like this and they can't hit you. This allows players to sacrifice their very powerful okazeme for whatever the effects of the taunts are, and this allows for a heaping helping of both skill and player expression. Players would be able to showcase in their own gameplay how much they value the effects of their character's taunts, and they'd have to be very wise to know when it's more optimal to get a taunt off instead of going for knockdown pressure, or vice versa. Unfortunately, this isn't really how it ends up going in practice, because SF3 is in many cases a boneyard of potential, where good ideas simply don't manifest in the best way they could. The reality is that in this game, almost all taunts are nowhere near as valuable as your knockdown mix-up is, and for the very few personal actions that are considerably powerful, maybe to the point where you actually could conceivably make the trade, they're on characters that have either such fast-paced or powerful Oki that you couldn't dream of doing it, or they're on a character who simply doesn't have to make the sacrifice, period. For everyone else, taunts are either far too weak, far too poorly fitting for the character that has them, or just not as good of a use of your time as other things are. Let's break this down piece by piece while the moon-eating bear roars so loudly you can't possibly hear what I'm saying. So basically, the problem with taunts in Third Strike is, firstly, most taunts are just not nearly worth as much as Oki. For most characters, their taunt simply isn't good enough to justify giving up something as potent as a mix-up, and for some characters, it isn't even worth doing outside of, ironically, to taunt the enemy. For example, let's look at Elena. When Elena does a taunt, her next attack or combo gets to deal 18.8 more stun damage than normal. Even more importantly than the boost though, she can stack this taunt up to 4 times for a whopping 75% increase. Hypothetically, this could cause some insane stun damage with the right situation, but this situation is almost never going to occur against a real opponent who actually wants to win, because additional stun damage isn't really a significant effect, especially for Elena, who doesn't really do very much stun damage to begin with. But also, you'd have to spend like a quarter of the round just dancing. And your opponent can just do this. Even if you land what I believe is Elena's best, most stun-producing combo, you don't even get a full stun. You get like most of their bar. Hey guys, in the future Kaluka here to make a small correction. This is in fact not her most stun-producing combo. What's funny though is that the combo that I found that does the most stun, at least that I'm aware of, and this is after doing a little bit of research, this one being tucked away in a tiny little YouTube video, is almost comically unlikely to occur. You have to do a predictive EX overhead against an opponent that is jumping forward, and it has to hit in this specific way, after which you can then loop these overheads, which is even more expensive than the combo I showed before, and if you hit them all, you do in fact stun the opponent. This inherits all of the same problems that the other combo does, but she can in fact, in this one very niche situation, stun the opponent in one go. It is perhaps the stupidest combo I've seen in this entire game, and this is a pretty stupid game. Anyway, back to your regularly scheduled programming. If you're this far in the video, subscribe and join the Discord. And this is after doing 4 taunts during which you're giving up tempo, which builds its own stun because you're hitting them over and over, giving up Oki, which gives you an opportunity to build stun by throwing people or hitting them, and you've done a bunch of silly animations, which gives your opponent a second to rest and recover their stun gauge. And all of that is of course assuming you're not just taking damage for the attempt. To contextualize, Elena is a very fast and aggressive character when she wants to be, and if she wanted to build stun, she could be doing so with all manner of throws or hard to block and fast special moves like Mallet Smash, both of which come with the added benefit of building meter and killing people, which highlights another issue with taunts, which is that many of them are ill-fitting for the character they're on, Elena being just one of them. Like they do for her, most personal actions provide the character with a boost to some kind of stat of theirs. Characters either get damage, stun resistance, stun damage, or damage resistance, if they get any of these at all. The resistances typically last the entire round, and the damage increases only affect your next hit and combo. The tier list of these possibilities, at least in my opinion, goes damage, stun damage, damage, damage resistance, and then stun resistance. However, even among the characters who are blessed to get something as useful as more damage on their combos, there is a clear hierarchy of privilege. If you ever try out Third Strike for yourself, one thing you will quickly learn is that not every character in that game is made equal. And the same goes for the taunts. Every taunt is unique in how it delivers this boost because of their animations, which, in my opinion at least, were probably completed without consideration of the taunt's function, or perhaps even predated the idea of a personal action altogether. For example, Ibuki and Ken both get a damage increase on their next hit. Ken gets 31.8%, Ibuki gets 43%, so Ibuki is better off, right? Wrong. Ken only has to do this short beckoning animation, which he can do regardless of context as long as he isn't already doing something else. Ibuki's taunt only gives her the damage increase if she does this leapfrog over her enemy, and they have to get hit by the leapfrog. This makes Ken's taunt infinitesimally easier to complete in a real match than Ibuki's ever will be. Ibuki can combo into her taunt to guarantee it, but that requires her to get a specific hit, and also to hit the enemy in the first place. And hilariously, if damage is what you're trying to do, you wouldn't end a combo in the leapfrog. You can see this kind of poor fitting and counter-intuition everywhere in the game. Ken and Akuma get a huge damage boost from just doing a short animation, but somebody like Alex, who is a drastically worse character in every regard than either of those two, except in like, I don't know, stun output, only gets about 2/3 or half of the benefit from his taunt, depending on if it's Akuma or Ken. He can get more than either of them, but he has to charge his taunt by winding his arm over and over, foregoing any possible chance he had at taking advantage of a knockdown, and very likely setting himself up to get hit with an attack just to get a boost on a future hit that isn't even guaranteed to happen. One that you are now even less likely to hit since your opponent got to attack you. Sean and Dudley both throw something as a part of their personal action, and they both get a boost as well, but Sean only gets 12.5% more stun damage, and Dudley gets a flat 25% damage boost. Sean can stack his, but he has to wait for his soccer ball to disappear first, meaning he has to take a grueling amount of time to throw and lose 3 balls just to be able to hit a bit more stun on his next combo, if he gets that far. Dudley's 25% damage boost is far better because Dudley is already one of the highest damage characters in the entire game, and doing even more damage is just ludicrous. Urian's taunt gives him 31% more damage just like Ken's, and so does Yong's. However, Yong's also gives him 6% more damage on his next throw for some reason. Personally, I'm okay with taunts having different levels of usefulness and having different designs. Part of what makes Third Strike's roster so good is how truly unique each character plays. However, some of these taunts are appallingly bad compared to their peers, and frankly, which character ended up with which taunt has never struck me as a very well thought out process. For example, let's compare Alex and Ken again. Alex is in almost every way a weaker character than Ken. Ken is top 3 in this game, and Alex is probably bottom 5. He's slower, easier to juggle, his good combos are harder to get started, his anti-airs are mediocre, and his pressure is honestly pretty lacking for a guy with a huge command throw. Alex almost never uses his taunt, as explained earlier, because it is just so slow to get the most out of. Ken's taunt, on the other hand, is something that he will be using at least once per game, if not more often. You will most frequently see it after Super 3 specifically, and when Ken is anywhere near the corner. In this game, if you hit somebody with a super, they have an increased period before they can get back up. This basically creates an opportunity to taunt out of thin air, and Ken takes advantage of this as often as he possibly can. Alex, as a part of a divine punishment for anybody who comes from New York, doesn't get to hit his supers as easily as Ken does. And even when he does, there's not even a guarantee that his super works correctly, because sometimes his Super Art 2, Boomerang Raid, just falls out at the last hit because it's funny. Now, you might think that the name Super Art 2 implies the existence of a Super Art 1, maybe even 3 or 4. But no, there's only 3. 4 would be ridiculous. As chief of the numeration police, the mere suggestion of a 4 in this context means I have to place you under surveillance. But all characters in the game do have 3 supers, except Alex realistically only has 1. His other 2 supers are, against a competent and knowledgeable opponent, genuinely useless. Super Art 3 for Ken, known as Shippu, is also the only one he ever uses, but for much different reasons. Shippu is vastly more available than any other super in the entire game. In every way that a character could confirm into a super, Ken can do it, whereas Alex only has maybe a couple of ways to confirm into Boomerang. Ken can cancel his long-winded target combo that gives him ample time to see if he got a hit. He can cancel his stand unblockable crouching medium kick. He can link into it after any random jab or his medium punch. He can link into it after a low unblockable overhead. He can juggle into it after a DP. He can do it after a light chain. In fact, Shippu is uniquely so fast and has so much range that it can even hit enemies who've done things that are normally safe. For example, this long-range straight punch Dudley has is normally perfectly safe if the opponent blocks it. Against Shippu, however, things are different. Ken can do this for what is honestly a problematically long list of attacks that are otherwise designed with the intention that they'll be safe outside of being parried. Basically speaking, Ken can hit a lot more SA3s than Alex can hit SA2s. This means that Ken can routinely get effectively free taunts, leading to more damage increases and, as has been the case for the last 20 years, more victories. Now, I'm only a little bit late to start suggesting things for the future of Street Fighter 3, but hypothetically, if you were to swap the taunts for these two characters, it would fit each one much better. Alex could justify using his taunts ever, because they would be fast, making all of his single-hit attacks much more threatening. And Ken would truly be forced to decide between Oki and a charged taunt in any of his post-super situations, making it so Shippu isn't quite as oppressive in this, at least very small, way. This would be a serious point of player expression for every Ken player. Do you want to sit there and go through the taunt animation, or do you want to run your offense? And this is what taunts should have been in this game, but sadly just kinda aren't. There's also things like how there are taunts in this game that give characters both strike attack damage and additional throw damage, but Alex isn't one of them, even though Alex is the second most command-throwing character in the game. For some reason, his taunt only increases the damage of his strike attacks, not his throws. Even though other grapplers, though Alex is technically more like a brawler, such as Hugo in this game, can use their taunts to increase the damage of his throws, just not Alex. Alex gets damage, just not the right kind. Another example of really poor fitting is somebody like Oro, who's much simpler. Oro can use his personal action to quickly take a nap, which is great for him because his friends just asked him if he wanted to play Valorant, and now he has an excuse not to. This cat nap allows Oro to rapidly recover stun, which sounds like it would be hypothetically useful in some situations. Any time where you're really high on stun, you would want to use this to get away from it. Except that Oro is one of 3 characters who are tied for having the highest stun resistance in the entire game. So Oro is among the characters who least ever need to reduce their stun gauge across the entire roster because they can take more of it. Not to mention that Oro's combos can be pretty long, so with the right hit, he'll start to recover his stun gauge naturally, without any need for a sleep. And again, the knockdowns you get from combos are frequently the best places to do a taunt, so the best times for Oro to taunt are the situations where he has already naturally recovered his stun gauge and no longer needs to. Or what about somebody like Remy, whose taunt is basically identical to Elena's minus their differing animations, making his significantly worse? Remy is the game's only real zoner, barely, which is a character archetype designed around keeping an opponent at bay with long limbs or projectiles, and then punishing their movement by baiting things like jumps. As a zoner, part of Remy's job is to keep people at the space he wants them at, and to not let them just get in and pummel him. So why on earth would you ever sit around and do a taunt which gives your opponent, at the absolute least, an opportunity to walk forward and take space uncontested? All of this on a character whose next attack or combo could very well just be one projectile or an anti-air. In fact, while you're zoning your opponent, they could just walk into a projectile intentionally, knowing that it almost completely wastes your taunt bonus. For much of the cast, taunts simply aren't a fitting, considerate, or useful thing to do. It's a huge waste of potential, but luckily, not every character is like this, and some characters get to use their taunts left, right, and center, which itself kind of poses another problem on the other end of the spectrum, characters who have no reason not to taunt. For some fighters, they're blessed with a taunt that fits very well into their character design, or at the very least, doesn't really cost them anything significant to perform. Ken has been our prime example, but I'll spare you the reiteration. Just know that while Ken does get to do a lot of taunts, I don't think that it necessarily means he has a very well-designed taunt. Kens don't use the taunt necessarily because they want to, they mostly use it just because they can, and it doesn't really cost them anything to do so. It doesn't make the character more interesting, it just makes you win more sometimes because it's free. And Ken isn't the only character who gets to abuse supers and their longer knockdowns to be able to taunt a lot. The second worst defender in this regard is probably Dudley. In fact, he might even be worse than Ken, because his third super, Corkscrew Blow, is exceedingly easy to combo into. In fact, he can end almost any touch with it. You can do Corkscrew Blow after a standing medium punch, after a crouching medium punch, after his dashing sway attacks, after an uppercut, after 2 crouching short kicks, after an overhead, after you hide the homeless person he hits with his vintage Oldsmobile, after an air-to-air, after this punch, and this punch, and this punch, and this punch too. You're going to see Dudleys take advantage of the longer knockdown more regularly than other characters by a mile, and you're going to see him taunt just as much as a result. Dudley's taunt, however, isn't like Ken's. It's not just a victory coupon, though in fairness it is very much a victory coupon. Instead, it's actually a real move that is designed to amplify the strongest parts of Dudley's game plan. It's basically everything he could have ever asked for in a taunt, and it borders on just being its own special move. And in fact, it returns in later games as just that, its own special move divorced from his taunts. Dudley's taunt has him throwing a rose at the enemy, and the rose can hit you. It only does 1 damage, but the important thing is that it allows Dudley to effectively force an opponent to block or parry it, because the rose will interrupt certain moves when done on wake up. Dudley's knockdown pressure is some of the most ferocious in the entire game. He has baldness-inducing Oki, partially because of this jailing potential. He can mix you up with multiple different options that require a specific form of blocking or parrying, and if he hits you because you're wrong, you can bet he's ending it in a combo to Corkscrew Blow, and that means you're getting knocked down again, and he gets another chance to run his offense over and over until either he's wrong and you block, or you die. This is far more well integrated into the character design of its host, helping support one of the strongest aspects of Dudley in a way that feels more natural and skillful for both parties than just making his existing moves stronger. In fact, this actually kind of highlights one of the other problems I think taunts in Third Strike have, which is that they're often not very creative. Almost everyone in the game has the same effects, as I've said, and most taunts are just a stat booster without anything else going on, which I don't think is personally very considerate of the character design or anywhere near as fun as the design space of a chore move can be. Plus, whatever percentage of damage is obviously great for every character, but at the same time, it doesn't really look at the character itself for inspiration, or do anything for each fighter specifically that could be more unique and beneficial for their moveset. Because there's an insane amount of untapped design potential that, if accessed, could have helped make taunts a more important part of the game like I believe they deserved to be. This is a small thing, but I think the potential of this is one of the most frustrating parts of Third Strike for me. You could do things like having a character's special moves gain some kind of new effect or property that makes them much more powerful, locking this strength behind the chore of doing a taunt. Or you could go further and lock entire moves behind having to do a taunt as well. Maybe for characters with multi-part or stacking taunts, that special move could get even stronger with each stack and give a character something they really want to capitalize on, or a tool they're otherwise missing that could be helpful in certain matchups. For Street Fighter 3 in particular, I can understand why some of this didn't happen. The entire point of the taunts was to reuse animation they already had, to get the most value out of it. And in fairness to the developers, it is pretty smart to use stun and damage as rewards for this sort of thing. Almost every match of the game is going to involve damage and stun, and players want as much damage and stun as they can get, and they want to prevent as much damage and stun as they can. It's incredibly versatile.
But still, even if modifications to damage and stun are all we're willing to work with, they still didn't attach these different bonuses to the right characters. And I know that because there's one character whose taunt is practically perfect, and that character is Q, and Q basically proves that it's everybody else who has a problem. Because unlike the rest of the roster, Q isn't a character that's going to avoid taunting because he shouldn't and doesn't really have a good reason to. And he's not only taunting because he can, or as an accessory to a more powerful and significant move. No, Q is actively trying to push scenarios where he can taunt for the express purpose of taunting itself. This is one of two things that makes Q really cool. The other thing would be his intro animation. Q's intro features children running away from him because he's a big scary monster man in a flasher coat. This detail was so important to the Q fanbase that one of the best and most venerated Q players in the game's history, a man named Kuroda, went on to become a child sex offender. Q's personal actions give him damage resistance, allowing him to stack up to 37% more toughness on an already very bulky character. This gives Q unparalleled defense and allows him to survive things that other characters simply cannot. Full shield's Q will have you questioning how much damage your character really does. Stacking all three taunts is very important for Q players because Q is otherwise fairly mediocre. He has really, and I mean really, like intentionally slow moves. Very mediocre combo availability, though very good combo damage. He's also quite slow, and many of his moves are unsafe, and his anti-airs are fine. This all sums up to mean that Q is going to get hit much more often than his opponent. It's vital for him to do these taunts so that he can mitigate the damage he's going to take and make up the difference. He only needs one clean hit to even things out, and the taunt gives you the survivability to get that far. This is what inspires Q players to go as far as to settle for blood taunts, which is a taunt that you know you're going to take some amount of damage for. Normally an unthinkable trade, but for a Q, not really that bad. This is what every taunt should have been, an active participant in the artistry of each character. But sadly, it just wasn't meant to be, and this is partially the fault of Capcom's then executive staff investing $190 million in 1998 on a UFC fighter known as Frail Bones McSickley. McSickley would go on to take one punch in UFC 98 and instantly turn into goo. Now if that doesn't sound bad enough, don't worry, because I just killed the last zombie without giving you a chance to hit the mystery box. And also because Street Fighter 3 is even more hostile to the concept of functional taunts than we've made it out to be with what we've discussed so far. Because 2000's Capcom made the realization that to suffer is to live, and so they decided to cap off one of the best fighting games ever made with one of the absolute worst fighting game mechanics that has ever been devised. For some god-awful reason, in Street Fighter 3, when you whiff a normal attack, you build super meter. Super meter is of the utmost importance to the game plans of many characters, to the point where certain characters are quantified differently based on whether or not they have a super available. And for some characters, their super is the entire game plan, and activating it basically just ends the round for them. So even if there were, say, some downtime, which there rarely would be anyway, but even if there were some downtime where, say, you and your opponent were at very far ranges, too far for either of you to reasonably do any of your attacks, which would be a great opportunity to load up a taunt and get your bonus and then go in for the kill, you're still unlikely to see anybody do it, because sitting there and whiffing normals over and over again to build super is just so much more valuable for every character. And since we're already talking about it, and I'm not going to get another chance, this is one of the most mind-bogglingly stupid ideas I've ever seen. Like, to explain this concept to the shooter side of my audience, imagine you're playing a hero shooter. Okay, I'm sorry. Imagine you're playing like a Titanfall, and you could get progress towards dropping your Titan by shooting the wall. So instead of everybody jumping around and sliding and fighting each other, they're all just shooting at the wall separately from one another so they don't die and can get their map hack. I think the final nail in the coffin for this whole idea was the transition from 2D sprite-based animations to 3D models. This channel is a fan of 3D animation, but I think pretty much every 3D animator or 3D generalist, whatever, would agree that at least after the setup phase, once you've modeled the character and you've rigged it and retopologized it or whatever, 3D animation is much easier than 2D. Or at the very least, it's much more versatile, which for a video game is great. For fighting games especially, this was a huge huge deal. You could just model the character one time, and then you can make as many moves as you wanted. You didn't have to redraw them from scratch. And since the point of these battle taunts was to take assets that were already made, that are really hard to make more of, and to get a little bit more use out of them, which you now no longer really needed to do because you could make new poses quite easily by comparison, there really wasn't a point to it anymore. Which is why in the future we saw a lot of games, if they had a similar move to this, would separate them from the taunt. And I think overall this is the correct approach. It's disappointing to see taunts not have this other functional side, but you don't really need them to do this, and I think it's overall better even for the player that these two things remain separated. Now there's no confusion between players as to what you're trying to communicate when you taunt. If you're taunting, people know that it's exclusively to taunt. You don't have to explain yourself and say, oh no, I'm not trying to get the functional thing, I am trying to make you mad, or vice versa. There's nobody misunderstanding your taunt as an actual taunt when you're just trying to get the boost. And even though Street Fighter and fighting games in general don't really commit to their taunts in the same way that Street Fighter 3 did, that doesn't mean that future games didn't do cool stuff with the idea. I mentioned it earlier, but Street Fighter 5 had an entire mechanic called a V-skill. Every character had 2 of them, and many V-skills were literally just animations or moves from Street Fighter 3, now redone in this new game. Except the things that these V-skills could do were much more creative and much more fitting for each character. For example, our old friend Alex still has his shoulder roll, but instead of merely increasing his damage after doing it like a million times, he only has to do it once, and it makes it so his next attack is treated as if it were a counter hit, which basically means that it can combo into things it normally can't. So in a sense, it does increase his damage because he's getting access to combo routes that he normally can't, better ones than he normally has. But it does it in a way that's more skillful for the player. They have to know and be able to adapt to a new route on the fly, and also it gives them something to fish for when they're playing in neutral. Street Fighter 5 rightfully gets a lot of shit because the first 3 years of the game were kind of a giant pain in the ass and it cost too much money and was unfinished, but I also think this game is a somewhat underrated treasure trove of really good mechanics. One that people only seem to hyperfixate on the bad parts of. And even though I wouldn't say that Street Fighter V's taunts were as good as Street Fighter 3's, I do think there were a lot of really cool things they did. Because I've now arbitrarily decided that this video is getting too long, we're gonna try to keep this brief. But while most characters' taunts were just taunts, there were some characters who went a little bit above and beyond. For example, Akuma's taunt has an actual attack in it, and while this seems like it's just a goofy little quirk of the taunt and something that's maybe going to happen like once a year, but not in any real context, and if that's what you think, I understand, but you're very wrong. Because this taunt cemented itself into history after being used in EVO Grand Finals. EVO's the biggest tournament of the year. Used by Tokido during his legendary 2017 run. If fighting games aren't something you've ever really understood, like you don't get why people would practice a video game, it's supposed to be fun, right? Why would you keep playing if you lost 10 times in a row? Why would you sit around in training mode and practice the same thing over and over? Just watch Tokido's run through EVO 2017, and I think after that you might finally get it. And Street Fighter 6 was no stranger to really nifty little Easter egg taunts as well. M. Bison and Akuma, 2 characters who back in the 90s were arcade mode boss fights for Street Fighter 2, were reintroduced into Street Fighter 6's roster with an optional boss event. These boss versions of the character had certain moves that were removed for the playable version, because they were obviously overpowered. But each character also has an elaborate and long-winded taunt, and I mean like long-winded. And if your opponent, for whatever reason, decides to allow you to go through this taunt the entire way, you unlock those locked moves. This is mostly useful just for playing with them in training mode or whatever, but hypothetically, if you knew about this in a ranked match and you just allowed your opponent to do it, you could maybe be the first guy to beat somebody who's playing Shin Akuma. And of course, there are many other fighting games who've done neat stuff with taunts. Art of Fighting 3, just off the top of my head, has this resource for both players that is really important because it's what allows you to do special moves at all. If you don't have the green bar, you're just stuck with normals, and taunting removes some of that meter away from your opponent, so it's actually a really important part of the game. This doesn't really count as a taunt, I guess, but in Street Fighter V, the character G has a special idle animation, and just like the Street Fighter 6 taunts, if you let it go through the whole animation, it has an attack at the end that is ludicrous in every way that an attack could be. It does like a million damage, stun, has a million frame advantage, all that other stuff. Now, this is the point of the video where I'm supposed to have a conclusion, but I don't really know what I would say. This video doesn't really have a point necessarily. The point was just that I think that this is a really cool concept, and I think these games have done it the best. I say this either not enough or too often, but I'm kind of disappointed more games don't do this like Team Fortress. Again, while the Street Fighter 3 approach is really good, we already talked about why it's kind of outdated and why we probably won't see it again. But I truly can't understand why more games don't allow you to have taunt kills. Again, I think it's because games where you don't really have that many opportunities to respawn have become very popular between either tactical, Counter-Strike-esque shooters, or battle royales, and I can understand why getting one shot by something in those games would be frustrating, but for tactical shooters, that happens all of the time anyway. And frankly, for everybody else, like, if you get killed by a fucking 5-second long animation that has one active frame, tough shit. As far as fighters are concerned, again, I completely understand why taunts have been separated from any form of functionality. That's fine, but I do wish more games had a V-skill, or a BlazBlue calls them overdrives, style move. A move, or like an entire mechanic even, that belongs uniquely to each character, maybe even multiples, that allows for the player to really voice their style. And I guess if I have to pick something, if games are going to have assassinations, they should do what they can to try to make them considerate of the gameplay, like Apex does. The only thing of, like, I guess what qualifies as profoundness here that I have to say is that it's kind of disappointing that taunts have never been so important to the wallets of games as they have been now, and, you know, for the last, like, 8 years or whatever, but also simultaneously so unimportant and so vapid in their gameplay. But yeah, aside from that, I don't really have anything. This video is basically just like a bunch of little instances of things I thought were cool all stitched together. If you've watched this far into the video, you have my thanks, and I'll find you. And since you're already here, you might as well subscribe and join the Discord, be a part of the community. Unless you're like hate watching, and you've done that for the last hour, in which case you may as well have just gone outside and gotten your head kicked in by a horse. I will join you all next time for a different kind of TF2 video. One that has to do with weapons, but perhaps not the ones you were expecting. Okay, I almost got you. I didn't forget about the challenge from the start of the video. I hope you already wrote your guess down, because here's the answer, and if you're cheating, I'll know. But my favorite taunt out of, I guess, any game probably has to be Fresh Brewed Victory. I know I talked a lot about taunts being a functional thing, and I do still think that is very important. But as far as just, like, a taunt goes, Fresh Brewed Victory has got to be one of my favorite ones. It is so sarcastic, so smarmy. It has great voice lines that associate with it. It is really iconic to me because of this really cool piece of TF2 art. And I also think when you're using it on your allies, it's very welcoming. But I already know that maybe like 1% of you got that. So I'm the fuck? Hello? What do you mean they all said Fresh Brewed Victory? That's not possible. What do you mean we're out $780,000 of store credit? We can't honor that. We're broken. We're bankrupt.